I walked into the Grandview Ballroom that Saturday night, carrying my grandmother's pearl clutch, the one she'd carried to her own daughter's wedding in 1953. The silk dress I'd chosen was vintage Givenchy, dove gray with hand-stitched lace at the collar, purchased from an estate sale for $47 3 months earlier. My daughter-in-law, Victoria, stood near the champagne fountain in her crimson gown, surrounded by her usual circle of corporate wives who laughed too loud and drank too fast. She saw me approach, and her expression shifted from polite to predatory in less than a second. Her friends noticed me too, their glances sliding from my silver hair to my hemline with barely concealed amusement. I felt their judgment like ice water down my spine, but I kept walking toward my assigned table near the back, where the lighting was dim and the servers rarely ventured. If you're watching from somewhere that values dignity over designer labels, subscribe and drop your city in the comments below. Victoria's voice carried across the marble floor before I'd taken 3 more steps. "Oh, Margaret, you actually wore that," Victoria said, her hand covering her mouth in mock surprise. Her diamond bracelet caught the chandelier light, throwing tiny rainbows across her wrist. The bracelet alone cost more than my monthly pension. I knew that because my son David had mentioned the price last Christmas when she'd opened it. Her friends turned in unison, their faces arranged in expressions of manufactured sympathy that felt worse than outright cruelty. One of them, a blonde woman named Cassandra, tilted her head and smiled the way you'd smile at a confused child. Another, Elena, actually reached out as if to touch my sleeve before thinking better of it. Victoria stepped closer, her heels clicking against the floor with military precision. She looked me up and down slowly, deliberately, making sure everyone nearby could witness my examination. The room temperature felt like it had dropped 10 degrees. My cheeks burned despite the cold. "I mean, this is the mayor's annual charity gala, not a church basement potluck," Victoria continued, her voice dripping with false concern. She gestured vaguely toward my dress, her manicured fingers fluttering in the air like dying butterflies. Her friends giggled behind their champagne flutes, the sound sharp and brittle. I noticed several other guests had stopped their conversations to watch our exchange, their eyes bright with the promise of scandal. Victoria fed on attention the way plants feed on sunlight, and right now, she was basking in a spotlight of her own creation. My son David stood 20 feet away talking to a city councilman, completely unaware of what was happening to his mother. Or perhaps he was aware and simply chose not to see. That thought hurt more than Victoria's words. I clutched my grandmother's pearl clutch tighter, feeling the worn silk against my palm. The pearls inside clicked together softly. "You're going to embarrass yourself in that dress," Victoria said, louder now, ensuring her audience could hear every syllable. She turned to Cassandra and Elena, including them in her performance. "I told David his mother should let me take her shopping, but she insisted on wearing something from her own closet. You know how stubborn older women can be about accepting help." The words "older women" landed like stones. I was 71 years old, yes, but I'd taught English literature at Westfield High for 38 years before retiring. I'd raised 2 sons as a widow after my husband died in a construction accident when David was only 7. I'd balanced budgets, attended parent-teacher conferences, chaperoned school dances, and somehow managed to keep food on the table and hope in my heart. Victoria knew none of that, or if she did, she considered it irrelevant. To her, I was simply an inconvenient relic from David's past, someone to be tolerated at holidays and dismissed the rest of the year. I stood there for a moment, letting her words settle in the space between us. The ballroom's crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the silk wallpaper, and somewhere, a string quartet played Vivaldi with mechanical precision. I could have explained that my dress was genuine vintage couture, that the lace alone was worth more than anything currently sold in the department stores Victoria frequented. I could have mentioned that my grandmother had worn this very clutch when she met Eleanor Roosevelt at a war bond rally in 1943. I could have told her that dignity and grace have nothing to do with price tags or fashion seasons, but I didn't. Instead, I smiled the way my mother taught me to smile when faced with people who mistake cruelty for cleverness. I adjusted the pearl clutch under my arm and turned away from Victoria's expectant face. She wanted a reaction, wanted me to stammer or apologize or retreat in shame. I would give her none of those things. I walked straight toward the nearest waiter, a young man in his 20s with kind eyes and a professional demeanor. He was carrying a silver tray of champagne flutes, moving smoothly between clusters of guests who barely acknowledged his existence. I'd noticed him earlier, watching how he navigated the room with quiet efficiency, how he smiled even when people ignored him or spoke to him as if he were furniture. He reminded me of several students I'd taught over the years, young people working their way through college or supporting families while maintaining their sense of self-worth. When I reached him, I spoke clearly and calmly, my voice carrying just far enough for Victoria and her friends to hear. "Excuse me, I'd like to be seated at the owner's table, please." The waiter's expression shifted from professional courtesy to something I couldn't quite read. He glanced past me toward Victoria, then back to my face. His mouth opened slightly. Behind me, I heard Victoria's sharp intake of breath. The waiter set his tray down on a nearby service stand with careful precision. His hands were steady, but I noticed his fingers trembled slightly as he adjusted his bow tie. "Mrs. Chen," he said, and his voice carried a weight that made several nearby conversations stop mid-sentence. "Mrs. Margaret Chen?" I nodded, and he actually bowed, a genuine bow from the waist that belonged in a different era entirely. The room around us had gone silent, the kind of silence that feels alive and dangerous. Victoria stood frozen 15 feet away, her champagne flute suspended halfway to her lips. Cassandra's eyes were wide. Elena had actually taken a step backward, as if physically distancing herself from what was about to happen. The waiter straightened and gestured toward the front of the ballroom, where a large round table sat on a raised platform beneath the largest chandelier. "Of course, Mrs. Chen. Right this way. We've been expecting you." The walk to that table felt like it lasted an hour, though it couldn't have been more than 90 seconds. Every eye in the ballroom tracked my movement across the marble floor. The waiter walked slightly ahead, his posture rigid with purpose. I kept my grandmother's clutch pressed against my ribs, feeling my heartbeat through the worn silk. My vintage Givenchy rustled softly with each step, the hand-stitched lace collar brushing against my collarbone. The owner's table sat empty, its white tablecloth pristine, its silver settings gleaming under the chandelier's light. 5 chairs surrounded it, though I'd only expected one. The waiter pulled out the center chair, the one facing the entire ballroom, and waited. I could feel Victoria's stare burning into my back like a brand. I could imagine her mind racing, trying to piece together what was happening, trying to understand why the woman she'd just mocked was being treated like visiting royalty. I sat down slowly, arranging my dress carefully around my knees. The chair was upholstered in midnight blue velvet, far more comfortable than the folding chairs at my assigned table in the back. From this vantage point, I could see the entire room spread out like a stage set, all the guests in their expensive clothes playing their parts. Victoria still stood near the champagne fountain, her face the color of chalk. David had finally noticed something was wrong and had started moving toward his wife, his expression confused. The waiter placed a menu in front of me, leather-bound and heavy. "The prime rib is excellent tonight, Mrs. Chen," he said quietly. "Chef Marcus prepared it especially." I nodded my thanks, and he stepped back, taking up a position near the wall where he could monitor the table. The silence in the ballroom was starting to fracture, people whispering behind their hands, phones being subtly raised to capture whatever was happening. A woman in her 50s approached the platform, her burgundy gown flowing behind her like a cape. She wore a gold name tag that read, "Carolyn Westfield Event Coordinator." I recognized her immediately, though we hadn't spoken in perhaps 2 years. She'd been one of my students in the late 1980s, a quiet girl with dyslexia who everyone said would never graduate. I'd spent lunch periods with her for an entire semester, teaching her strategies to decode text, building her confidence sentence by sentence. She'd sent me a card when she graduated college, another when she got married. The last I'd heard, she was working in event management somewhere downtown. Now she stood beside my table with tears threatening to ruin her carefully applied mascara. "Mrs. Chen," Carolyn said, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know you'd be here tonight. When I saw your name on the guest list, I thought it must be someone else with the same name." "Hello, Carolyn," I said warmly, reaching up to squeeze her hand. Her fingers were cold despite the warmth of the ballroom. "You look wonderful. Event coordinator for the mayor's gala, that's quite an achievement." She laughed, a sound somewhere between joy and tears. You always said I could do anything if I worked hard enough. I still have the essay you wrote in my graduation yearbook. I read it whenever I doubt myself. She glanced over at Victoria, who was now in heated, whispered conversation with David, her hands gesturing wildly. Elena and Cassandra had disappeared entirely, melted back into the crowd like ghosts. Carolyn's expression hardened. I saw what happened earlier, Mrs. Chen. I'm so sorry. If I'd known someone was treating you that way, I would have intervened. I patted her hand gently. You have nothing to apologize for, dear. Sometimes people reveal their character in ways we don't expect. Carolyn straightened, her professional demeanor sliding back into place like armor. Mrs. Chen, I need to tell you something important. This table, the owner's table, it's reserved for Julia Hartman. She owns the Grandview venue and specifically requested that this table remain empty until she arrived. She's running late tonight, stuck in traffic from the airport. I nodded slowly, beginning to understand. Julia Hartman, I repeated. The name was familiar, tugging at memories from decades past. Carolyn smiled, and suddenly she looked exactly like the nervous 15-year-old who used to sit across from me during lunch period. Julia Hartman was Julia Morris when you taught her. She was in your junior English class in 1987. She always said you were the only teacher who believed she could write, who saw past her behavior problems to the person underneath. The pieces clicked together in my mind like tumblers in a lock. Julia Morris had been one of the most challenging students I'd ever taught. Brilliant but angry, lashing out at everyone who tried to help her. She'd been in foster care, bounced between homes, wearing the same 3 outfits in rotation. The other teachers had written her off as hopeless, destined for dropout statistics and worse. But I'd seen something in her essays, raw talent buried under layers of pain and defensive rage. I'd kept her after class one day, not to lecture her, but to tell her that her writing about her foster sister's adoption had made me cry, that she had a gift for capturing human emotion on the page. She'd looked at me like I'd grown a second head. After that, she started turning in assignments voluntarily. She'd still gotten into fights, still mouthed off to administrators, but she showed up to my class and she wrote. By senior year, she'd won a regional writing competition. I'd written her college recommendation letter myself, though I'd never heard if she'd actually attended. Julia built a real estate empire, Carolyn continued, her voice filled with pride. She started with one small property downtown, 22 years ago, and now she owns 17 commercial buildings in the city, including this venue. She's worth approximately $43 million according to the Business Journal's last estimate. She still keeps the letter you wrote her framed in her office. She told me once that you were the first person who ever made her feel like she mattered, like her thoughts and words had value. I felt my throat tighten with emotion. $43 million, 17 buildings. And she remembered an old English teacher who'd simply told her the truth about her talent. Carolyn glanced toward the entrance. She called me 30 minutes ago from her car. She's about 15 minutes out now. She always sits at this table during events, surveys the room, makes sure everything's running smoothly. It's her signature spot. I started to rise from the velvet chair. Then I should move. I don't want to take her table. Carolyn placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, keeping me seated. Mrs. Chen, with all due respect, Julia would be furious with me if I let you move. When she gets here and finds out you were treated poorly by other guests and then hears that I made you sit somewhere else, she'll have my job. Please, stay. Let me bring you some wine. The Chateau Margaux is from her personal collection. She signaled to another server, who appeared with a bottle and crystal stemware. The wine poured ruby red, catching the chandelier light. I accepted the glass because refusing seemed like it would create more difficulty than acceptance. Victoria was now approaching the platform with David in tow, her face a mask of confused fury. Her heels clicked against the marble like gunshots. The moment I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure had finally arrived. "Mother, what's going on?" David asked, his voice strained with embarrassment. He'd inherited his father's height and my stubborn chin, but somewhere along the way he'd learned to prioritize his wife's comfort over his mother's dignity. That was partly my fault, I supposed. I'd raised him to be considerate, to value his partner's feelings, but I'd never imagined he'd marry someone who would weaponize that consideration. Victoria stood beside him, her champagne flute empty now, her lipstick slightly smudged at one corner. Up close, I could see the fine lines around her eyes that her makeup tried to hide, the tension in her jaw. "David, I'm simply sitting where the staff directed me," I said calmly. "Is there a problem?" Victoria's voice came out sharp and high. "This is the owner's table, Margaret. You can't just sit here because you're upset about a harmless comment. This is embarrassing. People are staring." "People are staring because you made a spectacle earlier," Carolyn interjected smoothly, her event coordinator's smile frozen in place. "Mrs. Chen is a guest of honor, invited personally by the venue owner. She's entitled to sit wherever she's welcomed." Victoria blinked, clearly trying to process this information. Guest of honor? She's David's mother. She's here as family, not as anyone important. The words landed like physical blows, each one precision-crafted to cut. Not anyone important. 38 years teaching teenagers to think critically, to write with clarity, to see beyond their own limited perspectives. Apparently all of that amounted to not being important. I took a sip of the Chateau Margaux and let it rest on my tongue for a moment before swallowing. It tasted like summer cherries and oak barrels, like patience and time. "Victoria," I said quietly, "you should return to your friends. I'm sure they're wondering where you've gone." David's face had gone red, the way it used to when he was a boy caught in a lie. "Mom, I think there's been some kind of mistake. We were assigned table 12. That's where we should all sit, together, as a family." He emphasized the last word, trying to anchor me with obligation. But I'd spent too many years being anchored by other people's expectations. My husband had died at 41, leaving me with 2 young sons and a mortgage I could barely afford on a teacher's salary. I'd worked summer jobs, tutored students in the evenings, sold my engagement ring to pay for David's college textbooks. I'd sacrificed my own dreams of writing a novel, of traveling to Paris, of so many things, to ensure my boys had opportunities I'd never had. And I'd done it gladly, without resentment. But I would not be humiliated by my son's wife in a public venue while he stood silent. Not anymore. "David, your mother is fine where she is," Carolyn said firmly. She'd pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. "In fact, I'm texting Julia now to let her know Mrs. Chen is here. She'll be thrilled." Victoria's expression transformed from irritated to alarmed. "You don't need to bother the owner. We can sort this out ourselves. I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding." She turned to me, her voice taking on a conciliatory tone that rang false. "Margaret, I apologize if my comment earlier came across as rude. I was only trying to be helpful, suggesting that you might feel more comfortable in something more contemporary." I set down my wine glass carefully. The venue's string quartet had started playing again, filling the awkward silence with pachelbel. Other guests had returned to their conversations, though I noticed many eyes still flickering in our direction. The mayor himself stood near the bar, talking to the police chief, both of them glancing occasionally toward our drama. "Victoria, when you mock someone's appearance in front of witnesses, you're not being helpful. You're being cruel. There's a difference, though I understand you might not recognize it." My voice remained level, almost gentle, which somehow made the words more devastating. Victoria's mouth opened and closed silently. David reached for his wife's elbow, trying to steer her away, but she shook him off. "I don't appreciate being lectured by someone wearing a dress older than my marriage," Victoria snapped, her carefully constructed politeness finally cracking. "You may have everyone here fooled with this victim act, but I know what you're doing. You're trying to make me look bad because you've never approved of me." That was partially true. I'd never approved of how Victoria treated people she considered beneath her, how she measured worth in stock portfolios and zip codes. But I'd kept my opinions to myself for 7 years, attending holidays with a smile, buying thoughtful gifts, complimenting her cooking even when the roast was dry. Before I could respond, a commotion near the entrance caught everyone's attention. The ballroom doors swung open with dramatic flair, and a woman strode in with the confidence of someone who owned not just the building, but possibly the entire city block. Julia Hartman was 54 now, wearing a black pantsuit that probably cost more than my car, her gray-streaked hair cut in a sharp bob. She scanned the room with the intensity of a general surveying a battlefield, her gaze landing on the owner's table and stopping when she saw me. Her face broke into the widest smile I'd seen in years. She crossed the ballroom in 15 seconds flat, her heels clicking with purpose, and suddenly I was being pulled into a hug that smelled like expensive perfume and coffee. Mrs. Chen, oh my God, Mrs. Chen. Julia pulled back, her hands gripping my shoulders. Carolyn texted me that you were here. I can't believe it. 29 years. It's been 29 years. I felt tears prick my eyes, something that happened too easily now that I was past 70. Julia, look at you. I heard you've done remarkably well for yourself. She laughed, a sound that was both joyful and slightly wild. Done well? Mrs. Chen, I'm rich enough to buy this entire ballroom and set it on fire just for fun. And it's because you told me I could write, because you spent your lunch periods teaching a screwed-up foster kid how to believe in herself. She turned to David and Victoria, her smile turning sharp. And who are these people bothering you? Victoria had gone pale, all her earlier aggression evaporating. David stammered something about being my son. Julia's eyebrows rose. Your son? And he's letting his wife mock you in my ballroom? Interesting family dynamic. The temperature around us dropped to Arctic levels. Victoria actually took a step backward, her expensive heels catching on her gown's hem. It was a misunderstanding, Victoria managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean any disrespect. Julia looked at Carolyn, who'd been standing nearby watching the scene unfold. Carol, what happened? Carolyn's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing anger underneath. This woman, she gestured toward Victoria, loudly mocked Mrs. Chen's dress in front of a group of guests, told her she was going to embarrass herself, made comments about stubborn older women. Multiple people witnessed it. Mrs. Chen handled it with more grace than the situation deserved. Julia's expression went from curious to furious in the space of a heartbeat. She turned to Victoria with the kind of cold intensity that probably terrified her business competitors. Let me make sure I understand. You saw an elderly woman in a beautiful vintage dress, a woman who turns out to be the beloved mother of your husband, and your first instinct was to humiliate her publicly? Victoria's face had gone blotchy, red patches appearing on her neck and cheeks. I didn't realize who she was to you. I thought she was just... She stopped, realizing that any sentence ending with just would only make things worse. Julia crossed her arms. Just what? Just an old woman in an unfashionable dress? Just someone you could safely mock because you assumed she had no power or connections? The ballroom had gone silent again, everyone watching. This was the scandal they'd all been hoping for when they bought their $100-a-plate tickets. The mayor had actually moved closer, clearly prepared to intervene if necessary. 2 city council women stood near the bar, whispering behind their hands. A local news reporter I recognized from Channel 7 was subtly recording on her phone. This moment would be on social media within the hour, dissected and shared and memed into oblivion. David finally found his voice. Ms. Hartman, I apologize for my wife's behavior. It was inappropriate and unkind. We'll leave immediately. He reached for Victoria's arm, clearly desperate to extract them both from the situation. Julia held up one hand. No, don't leave. I insist you stay. In fact, I insist you both join us at this table. She gestured to the empty chairs surrounding me. Mrs. Chen, would that be acceptable to you? I looked at my son, really looked at him, seeing the scared boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, the teenager who'd sobbed in my arms when his high school girlfriend dumped him, the young man who'd promised at his wedding to always honor his family. And I saw the middle-aged man who'd stood silent while his wife belittled his mother, who'd chosen the path of least resistance over defending what was right. The disappointment I felt was a physical weight in my chest. They can sit if they'd like, I said softly. But I think Victoria and I need to have an honest conversation first. Julia nodded approvingly and claimed the chair to my right. Carolyn excused herself to handle other coordinator duties, but not before squeezing my hand one more time. The waiter appeared with additional wine glasses, filled them efficiently, then disappeared. David and Victoria remained standing awkwardly, unsure whether sitting down would be accepting an invitation or walking into an ambush. Victoria's champagne flute trembled in her hand. I gestured to the chairs across from me. Please, sit. They sat. The velvet chairs seemed to swallow them both. From this angle, with the chandelier light casting shadows across their faces, They looked young and lost. Victoria couldn't meet my eyes. David stared at his hands folded on the white tablecloth. "Victoria," I began, keeping my voice gentle, despite the hurt still burning in my chest. "Why do you think I'm a threat to you?" Victoria's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. Whatever she'd expected me to say, it wasn't that. I'm not threatened by you." The lie was transparent. Julia made a small sound of disbelief, but stayed quiet, letting me lead. I leaned forward slightly. "You've spent 7 years trying to minimize my presence in David's life. You schedule holidays at times you know conflict with my church commitments. You've never asked about my past, my career, my interests. You give me generic gifts bought by your assistant while I research and find personal presents for you. You've never invited me to your home when it wasn't a major holiday. And tonight, you tried to humiliate me in public. So I ask again, why do you see me as a threat?" Victoria's lower lip trembled. David looked at his wife with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between realization and shame. The ballroom sounds faded into background noise. "Because you're perfect," Victoria said finally, her voice breaking. "You're this perfect mother who sacrificed everything, who raised 2 sons alone, who worked a noble career helping teenagers, who everyone loves and respects. And I'm just someone who married well and shops too much and doesn't know how to talk to you without feeling inadequate." Tears were running down her face now, destroying her carefully applied makeup. "Every time David talks about his childhood, he mentions something you did for him, some way you supported him. And I think about my own mother who was never there, who chose her career over her family. And I get so angry at her, but somehow it comes out directed at you." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing mascara across her temple. "I know that's not fair. I know it's not your fault, but I couldn't seem to stop myself." The admission hung in the air between us like smoke. I felt my anger soften, not disappearing but transforming into something more complex. Hurt could come from places we didn't expect, could be transmitted through generations like genetic traits. Victoria's mother, whom I'd met only once at the wedding, had been a corporate lawyer, brilliant and driven and emotionally absent. Victoria had grown up with nannies and boarding schools and parents who showed love through stock transfers and trust funds. She'd learned to equate worth with wealth, value with visible success. And here I was, a retired teacher with a modest pension and a small house, somehow still commanding respect and love from her husband. It must have felt like an equation that didn't balance, like proof that her own mother's priorities had been wrong. Understanding someone's pain doesn't excuse their behavior, but it does change how you respond to it. "Victoria, I'm not perfect," I said quietly. "I made countless mistakes raising my sons. I worked too much, missed baseball games and school concerts because I was exhausted from teaching other people's children. I lost my temper and said things I regretted. I let grief over my husband's death make me distant sometimes when David needed me to be present. The difference is that David remembers the good things because he chooses to, because that's love. It's not a competition you're losing." Julia was watching our exchange with intense interest, her wine glass forgotten on the table. Other guests had mostly returned to their own dramas, though I noticed the mayor still hovering within earshot. David reached across the table and took Victoria's hand. "Vic, I had no idea you felt this way. Why didn't you tell me?" Victoria laughed bitterly. "How could I? Hey, honey, I resent your mother for being a good parent. That makes me sound like a monster." "It makes you sound human," I said. "We all carry wounds from childhood. The question is what we do with them." I paused, choosing my next words carefully. "But Victoria, understanding why you hurt someone doesn't make the hurt disappear. You humiliated me tonight in front of strangers. You've been subtly excluding me from David's life for years. I've tolerated it because I didn't want to create conflict, because I believed being a good mother meant accepting whatever crumbs of relationship you were willing to offer. But I won't do that anymore." Victoria's face crumpled. "I understand. You don't want to see me anymore. I've ruined everything." I shook my head. "That's not what I said. I said I won't tolerate being treated poorly. There's a difference." I took a breath, feeling the weight of my 71 years and all the lessons they'd taught. "If you're willing to work on treating me with basic respect, I'm willing to try building a better relationship. But that means therapy, Victoria. The word therapy seemed to echo across the table. Victoria wiped her eyes again, her mascara now completely destroyed. You want me to go to therapy because I made one comment about your dress? Her voice held a note of defensive disbelief. Julia cut in smoothly. She made multiple comments. I heard about them from 3 different sources before I even walked through the door. The Grandview staff talks, Victoria. And what they described wasn't one comment. It was a pattern of cruelty. Victoria flinched. David squeezed her hand tighter. Vic, Mom's right. This isn't just about tonight. I've watched you exclude her from our lives for years, and I let it happen because it was easier than confronting the problem. That's on me too. He turned to me, his eyes red-rimmed. Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have defended you earlier. I should have defended you years ago. I was a coward. Hearing my son acknowledge his failure split my heart in 2 directions at once. Part of me wanted to comfort him, to tell him it was all right, that parents are supposed to absorb pain so their children don't have to. But part of me knew that healing required honesty, even when honesty hurt. Yes, David, you were a coward. And that disappointed me more than anything Victoria said tonight. David absorbed the blow, nodding slowly. Victoria was crying harder now, her shoulders shaking. Julia pushed a cloth napkin across the table toward her. Here, your makeup is everywhere. Victoria took the napkin gratefully and pressed it to her face. Around us, the gala continued. Waiters circulated with appetizers. I could smell garlic and butter and something with truffle oil. The string quartet had moved on to Mozart, the notes bright and orderly. The mayor had finally retreated to his own table, apparently satisfied that no actual violence would erupt. I felt exhausted suddenly, the adrenaline of the confrontation draining away, leaving only tiredness in its wake. Therapy, Victoria said finally, her voice muffled by the napkin. Okay, I'll go to therapy. But I want you to come to some sessions too. She lowered the napkin and looked at me directly for the first time all evening. Not because you need it, but because I don't think I can talk about my mother and you without getting everything confused. Does that make sense? It did make sense, in a painful way. I nodded. I can do that. But Victoria, I need you to understand something. Therapy isn't a magic solution. You're going to have to do hard work examining why you treat people the way you do. And I'm going to have to do hard work forgiving you, which won't happen overnight. Victoria nodded, fresh tears spilling over. I know, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Margaret. I was cruel tonight, and you didn't deserve it. The apology felt genuine, raw with emotion. I wanted to believe it would stick, that we could build something better from this wreckage. Julia had been quiet for several minutes, but now she spoke up. Mrs. Chen, I have a proposition for you. Every year, the Grandview hosts a scholarship gala in September for students pursuing teaching degrees. I fund 5 full-ride scholarships annually in honor of the teacher who changed my life. That's you, though I've kept your name private because I didn't want to make you uncomfortable. She pulled out her phone, scrolled for a moment, then showed me the screen. It displayed a web page for the Julia Hartman Teaching Excellence Scholarship Fund, with a mission statement about supporting future educators. 5 full scholarships, meaning tuition, room, board, and books for 4 years. I calculated quickly, easily $40,000 per student, $200,000 total per year. I'd like you to be on the selection committee, read the applications, meet the candidates, help me choose who receives the awards. You'd be compensated, of course, and it would only require about 20 hours of work spread across a few months. The offer stunned me into silence. 20 hours of work to help choose future teachers, to read essays about why young people wanted to dedicate their lives to education. It sounded like a gift disguised as a job. Julia, I don't know what to say. Julia grinned. Say yes. I've been wanting to ask you for 2 years, but I couldn't find you. You're not on social media, your phone number is unlisted, and the school district wouldn't give me your contact information because of privacy policies. When Carolyn texted me that you were here tonight, I almost caused an accident speeding back from the airport. She paused. Also, the selection meetings are held here at the Grandview, in the private dining room upstairs. You'd get to come back to this building regularly, sit in nice chairs, eat good food, and help deserving kids. It seems like a win for everyone involved. David was looking at me with an expression of pride mixed with sadness, as if seeing me through fresh eyes. "I'd love to," I said, and felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in hours. "That sounds perfect." Julia clapped her hands together. "Excellent. I'll have my assistant send you the details next week. We're reviewing applications starting in November, so you'll have time to settle into the role." She stood up, smoothing her expensive pantsuit. "Now, I need to go greet the mayor before he thinks I'm ignoring him completely. But Mrs. Chen, I meant what I said earlier. You changed my life. I was heading toward jail or worse, and you treated me like I mattered. Every scholarship I give, every student who becomes a teacher because of that scholarship, that's your legacy continuing." She leaned down and kissed my cheek, then walked away toward the mayor's table with the confidence of someone who owned half the city. Victoria watched Julia go, her expression complicated. "She really loves you," Victoria said softly. "Everyone here respects you, and I tried to humiliate you." "Yes, you did," I agreed. There seemed no point in softening the truth. "But people make mistakes, Victoria. What matters is what they do after the mistake." The waiter appeared again, this time with menus. "Mrs. Chen, will your party be dining with us this evening? The kitchen is ready to serve whenever you'd like." I looked at David and Victoria. They looked back at me, both of them hollow-eyed and exhausted from the emotional confrontation. "Are you staying?" I asked them. David nodded immediately. Victoria hesitated, then nodded as well. "If you'll have us," she said. "I don't deserve to sit at this table, but I'd like to try earning that privilege." I gestured to the waiter. "We'll all stay. Could you bring us the special menu, please?" He nodded and disappeared. Around us, the gala continued its elaborate dance of money and power and social positioning. But at our table, something different was happening. Something quieter and harder and more real. "Tell me about your job, Victoria," I said, making a conscious effort to open a door. "David mentioned you're working with a non-profit now." Victoria looked surprised by the question. "I started volunteering with an organization that helps foster children transition to independent living. It's just a few hours a week, but it's the most meaningful thing I've done in years." Her voice held a note of genuine passion I'd never heard before. "A lot of these kids age out of the system with no support, no family, no idea how to navigate adult responsibilities. We help them find apartments, budget money, apply for jobs, basic stuff that most people learn from their parents." She paused. I kept thinking about my own childhood, how I had everything material but nothing emotional. These kids have the opposite problem, and I thought maybe I could help somehow. I felt my perception of Victoria shift again, revealing layers I hadn't known existed. "That's important work," I said sincerely. "Foster children fall through cracks in the system all the time. Having someone who cares enough to help them transition makes a real difference." Victoria's eyes filled with tears again. I think about Julia, about what she said earlier. She was in foster care. She could have ended up hopeless and lost. But you saw her, really saw her, and gave her something no one else had. I want to do that too, in whatever small way I can. The conversation continued as dinner arrived. Prime rib cooked perfectly medium rare, roasted vegetables with herbs I couldn't name, potatoes that melted on the tongue. We talked about Victoria's volunteer work, about David's recent promotion, about my garden and the tomatoes that had finally ripened after a cool summer. We talked like people who were trying, genuinely trying, to understand each other. It wasn't comfortable, and it wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And honesty felt like progress. Julia returned to our table between courses, bringing the mayor with her. He was a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and a politician's practiced smile. "Mrs. Chen, Mayor Patterson wanted to meet you," Julia said, clearly enjoying herself. "I told him about the scholarship fund and your role in it." The mayor extended his hand. "Mrs. Chen, it's an honor. Julia speaks very highly of you. I understand you taught at Westfield High for nearly 40 years? I shook his hand. 38 years, actually. I retired 5 years ago. The mayor nodded. "My daughter had you for junior English in 2004. Sarah Patterson. She still talks about the way you taught the Scarlet Letter, how you made her understand that literature was about human nature, not just old books." I remembered Sarah, a bright girl with test anxiety who'd blossomed once she learned to trust her own analytical skills. "Sarah was an excellent student. I hope she's doing well." "She's a public defender now," the mayor said proudly. Says you taught her to look beneath the surface, to understand that people are complex and deserve to be seen fully. That's become the foundation of her legal practice. He paused. Mrs. Chen, the city is always looking for volunteers to serve on various committees and boards. Would you be interested in joining the Education Advisory Board? We meet quarterly to discuss school district policies, advocate for teacher resources, that sort of thing. We could use someone with your experience. I hesitated. The teacher in me wanted to say yes immediately, wanted to continue serving education even in retirement. But the 71-year-old woman who'd just spent hours in emotional combat was exhausted. Could I think about it? The mayor nodded. Of course. Julia has my contact information. Reach out whenever you're ready. He shook my hand again and returned to his table. David was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Mom, I had no idea you'd impacted so many people, David said quietly. I knew you were a good teacher, but this, Julia owning buildings, the mayor knowing who you are, scholarship funds, I never realized. I smiled sadly. You were busy building your own life, David. That's what children are supposed to do. And I never talked much about my students or my work. I kept my professional life and family life separate. That was true, but it was also a defense mechanism I developed after my husband died. Teaching had been my sanctuary, a place where I had control and could make measurable differences in young lives. Home had been chaos and grief and overwhelming responsibility. Keeping them separate had helped me survive those terrible years when I was drowning in loss and single parenthood. Victoria was listening intently, her makeup-smeared face serious. Margaret, I owe you more than just an apology about tonight. I've judged you as irrelevant, as just David's mother, without knowing anything about who you actually are. Yes, you have, I agreed. The waiter cleared our dinner plates and brought dessert, chocolate torte with raspberry coulis that was almost too beautiful to eat. I took a small bite, savoring the rich bitterness of the dark chocolate against the sweet tartness of the berries. The ballroom had thinned out slightly as some guests departed early, but most remained, dancing now to a live jazz band that had replaced the string quartet. The lighting had dimmed, creating an intimate atmosphere. Carolyn appeared at our table one final time. Mrs. Chen, I wanted to give you my card before you leave tonight. I meant what I said about staying in touch. And if you ever need anything, event coordination, connections, whatever, please call me. I took her card, quality cardstock with embossed lettering. Thank you, Carolyn, and congratulations on building such a successful career. I'm proud of you. She hugged me carefully, mindful of my dress, then disappeared into the crowd. The evening wound down slowly. Julia insisted on walking us to the parking garage, chatting about her various properties and business ventures. She'd bought her first building with money saved from 3 jobs and a small business loan that nearly bankrupted her. She'd renovated it herself, learning plumbing and electrical work from YouTube videos because she couldn't afford contractors. That first building had appreciated enough to leverage into a second property, then a third. Now she employed 200 people across her real estate empire and sat on the boards of 4 charitable organizations. I'm still that angry foster kid inside, she admitted as we walked. I still have to fight the urge to hoard money, to trust that success won't disappear overnight. Therapy helps. So does remembering that one teacher believed in me when no one else did. She hugged me goodbye in the parking garage, her arms strong and tight. Don't be a stranger, Mrs. Chen. I mean it. David and Victoria walked me to my car, a 12-year-old Honda Civic that I kept meticulously maintained. David opened the driver's door for me, a gesture he'd learned from watching his father. Mom, can we come over for dinner next week? No agenda, just family time. I looked at him, then at Victoria, who nodded hopefully. We can try that, I said. But Victoria, I'm serious about therapy, for both of you individually and as a couple. And eventually I'll join you for some sessions like we discussed. But this only works if you do the work. Victoria nodded, her ruined makeup making her look vulnerable and young. I'll call a therapist tomorrow, I promise. I squeezed her hand briefly, then got into my car. The engine started immediately, reliable as always. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them standing together under the garage's fluorescent lights. David's arm around Victoria's waist, both of them watching me leave. They looked like what they were, 2 people trying to figure out how to be better. The drive home took 25 minutes through sparse late-night traffic. I lived in a small 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood where children played in the streets during summer and neighbors knew each other's names. My house had been built in 1962 and needed work I couldn't afford. The roof leaked during heavy rain, the kitchen appliances dated back to the 90s, the carpet was worn thin in the hallways. But it was mine, paid off after 30 years of mortgage payments, and it held memories of my sons growing up, of Christmas mornings and birthday parties and ordinary Tuesdays doing homework at the dining room table. I pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment, letting the evening's events wash over me. My grandmother's pearl clutch sat on the passenger seat. I picked it up, feeling the worn silk, remembering my grandmother's hands, weathered from farm work, but still gentle when they touched my face. She'd been a woman of quiet strength, my grandmother, surviving the Depression and World War II and the loss of 3 children to illness. Inside the house, I hung my vintage Givenchy carefully in the closet, covered it with a garment bag to protect it. The dress had cost $47, but it had given me armor tonight when I needed it. I changed into my comfortable pajamas, the flannel ones my sons teased me about, and made myself a cup of chamomile tea. My kitchen was small and outdated, but functional. The countertops were original Formica, the cabinets solid oak that I'd refinished myself 10 years ago. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd graded papers for 38 years, where my sons had eaten countless meals, where I'd cried after my husband's funeral. The tea was hot and soothing. My phone buzzed with a text from Julia. Got home safe. Still can't believe I found you tonight. Coffee next week? My treat. Actually, my permanent treat from now on. You're never paying for anything when you're with me. XOXOJ. I smiled and texted back. Coffee sounds lovely. Thank you for tonight. Another text came through, this one from David. Mom, I love you. I'm sorry for tonight and for the last 7 years. I'll do better. We both will. I set the phone down without responding immediately. Love was complicated when it existed alongside disappointment. I did love David, loved him with the fierce protective instinct that motherhood had burned into my soul. But I was also disappointed in him, in his willingness to let his wife treat me poorly, in his silence when silence was betrayal. Those two truths could exist simultaneously, and maybe that was what growing older taught you, that love didn't erase hurt, that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, that relationships were complicated tangles of history and hope and hard choices. I would respond to his text tomorrow after I'd slept and processed the evening. Tonight I was too tired to craft the right words, the ones that were honest but not cruel, that set boundaries but left the door open. I finished my tea and walked through my small house, turning off lights, checking locks, performing the nighttime rituals that had become automatic over decades of living alone. In my bedroom, I looked at the photograph on my nightstand, my husband Thomas on our wedding day, young and handsome and alive, his arm around my waist, both of us grinning like we'd won the lottery. He'd been a construction worker, strong and funny and kind, the kind of man who remembered birthdays and fixed neighborhood kids' bicycles for free. His death at 41 had been sudden, a scaffolding collapse on a downtown building project. One phone call, one police officer at my door, and my entire world had shattered. I'd been 37 years old with 2 sons, a mortgage, and a teaching job that barely covered our expenses. The years after his death were a blur of exhaustion and determination, of working multiple jobs and somehow keeping our family afloat. I'd had no time to grieve properly, no space to fall apart. I climbed into bed, my bones aching in ways they didn't used to ache. 71 years old felt ancient some days and merely experienced on others. Tonight, I felt both. The confrontation with Victoria had required energy I could barely spare, but it had also felt necessary, like lancing a wound that had been poisoning our family for years. Would therapy help? Maybe. Victoria's admission about her own mother had been revealing, explaining motivations I hadn't understood. Hurt people, as the saying went. But understanding someone's pain didn't obligate you to absorb their cruelty indefinitely. I'd spent too many years trying to be the perfect mother, the perfect grandmother, the perfect ex-wife who never complained or made demands. That version of me had been ground down to nothing. The version of me who walked up to that waiter and asked for the owner's table. That version felt more authentic, more aligned with who I actually was beneath the layers of politeness and accommodation. Sleep came slowly, my mind replaying moments from the evening. Victoria's face when the waiter recognized me, Julia's fierce hug in the parking garage, David's expression when he realized how many lives I'd touched, the mayor's daughter who'd become a public defender because of a lesson on the Scarlet Letter, Carolyn's tears when she saw me at the owner's table. All these people, carrying pieces of me forward into the world, transformed by something I'd said or done decades ago. Teaching had never felt like a prestigious career, certainly not compared to Victoria's corporate lawyer mother or Julia's real estate empire. But impact wasn't measured in dollars or titles. It was measured in changed lives, in students who found their voices, in young people who learned to see themselves as capable and worthy. That was a kind of wealth that appreciated over time, compounding interest in the currency of human connection. I'd been rich all along. I'd just forgotten. Morning came with sunlight through my bedroom curtains. Sunday morning, which meant no obligations beyond the ones I chose for myself. I made coffee in my old percolator, the one I'd bought 30 years ago that still worked perfectly. The coffee was strong and bitter, exactly how I liked it. I carried my mug out to the back porch and surveyed my garden. The tomatoes were finally ripening, fat red orbs hanging heavy on their vines. The zucchini had overgrown again, massive green torpedoes that I'd need to give away to neighbors. My roses needed deadheading, and the herb garden required weeding. Small tasks, manageable tasks, the kind of work that kept your hands busy and your mind quiet. I'd spend the morning in the garden, I decided. Let the earth ground me. Let the simple act of tending growing things remind me what mattered. Later I'd respond to David's text, maybe call Julia to schedule that coffee. But right now, this moment belonged just to me. I thought about Victoria's comment from the night before. You're perfect. What a terrible burden to place on another human being, expecting them to be perfect. I wasn't perfect. I'd lost my temper with students who didn't deserve it. I'd forgotten to attend my son's school events when I was overwhelmed. I'd been too strict sometimes, too lenient others. I'd made 1,000 mistakes over 71 years. But I'd also tried, genuinely tried, to do right by the people in my life. And when I failed, I'd apologized and tried to do better. That was the most any human could offer. Not perfection, but persistent effort toward growth. Victoria's own mother had failed her in specific ways, creating wounds that Victoria now carried into her adult relationships. If therapy could help Victoria understand those wounds, could help her stop transmitting her pain to others, then maybe our family had a chance at something healthier. Not perfect, never perfect, but better than we'd been. The scholarship opportunity Julia had offered felt like a gift from the universe, a chance to continue doing work I loved without the exhaustion of full-time teaching. Reading essays from young people who wanted to teach, helping select candidates who would shape future generations, that was meaningful work. And being compensated for it meant I could afford small repairs around the house, maybe take a trip somewhere I'd always wanted to visit. When was the last time I'd traveled for pleasure? Not since before Thomas died, not in over 30 years. I'd always put other needs first. My son's education, house repairs, savings for emergencies. But maybe now, at 71, I could carve out space for small luxuries. A weekend in Charleston, a week in New Mexico seeing the desert. Nothing extravagant, just a chance to experience new places before I got too old to travel comfortably. The thought made me smile into my coffee mug. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from an unknown number. Mrs. Chen, this is Carolyn. Julia gave me permission to share your contact info. I wanted you to know that what happened last night has been the talk of the staff. You handled that situation with such grace. Also, I spoke to my mother this morning and told her about seeing you. She asked me to thank you again for helping me graduate. She said you saved our family. I just wanted you to know that you're appreciated, even when the world doesn't show it. And if you ever need anything, please reach out. I read the text 3 times, feeling warmth spread through my chest. These echoes of past work, these reminders that effort mattered, they felt like validation of a life well lived. I responded, Carolyn, thank you for those kind words. You saved yourself. I just helped you find tools you already had. I'm proud of the woman you've become. I spent the morning in the garden as planned, pulling weeds and pruning roses and harvesting tomatoes. The physical work felt good, using my body in ways that teaching never required. My hands got dirty, my knees ached from kneeling, sweat ran down my back despite the cool morning air. But when I finally stood up and surveyed the neat rows of plants, the satisfaction was immediate and tangible. You couldn't always see the results of teaching. Students carried your lessons internally, applied them in ways you'd never witness. But a garden showed its response to care immediately. Pull the weeds, the plants thrive. Water consistently, the fruit ripens. The cause and effect was clear and rewarding. By noon, I'd filled 2 bags with weeds and a basket with tomatoes. I washed up, changed clothes, and finally responded to David's text from the night before. I love you too. Dinner next Sunday works. Let me know what time. The rest of Sunday passed quietly. I read a novel I'd been working through for weeks, a mystery set in post-war England that reminded me why I'd always loved literature. I made myself a simple dinner, pasta with tomatoes from the garden, olive oil, garlic, fresh basil. I watched the evening news and shook my head at the state of the world, wars and scandals and political theater that made me grateful to be old enough to remember when discourse was more civil, even if that memory was probably rose-tinted by nostalgia. Around 8 o'clock, Julia called instead of texting. "Mrs. Chen, I hope I'm not bothering you. I just wanted to check in after last night." Her voice sounded different on the phone, less polished, more vulnerable. "You're not bothering me at all," I assured her. "How are you doing?" Julia laughed. "I should be asking you that. You're the one who got publicly mocked by your daughter-in-law." "I'm fine," I said, and realized it was true. It was an unpleasant situation, but it forced some necessary conversations. Sometimes conflict is the path to resolution. Julia was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Chen, I've built this entire empire, right? 17 buildings, millions of dollars, all this success. And every single day I wake up terrified that it's all going to disappear, that I'm going to end up back in foster care sleeping in a group home. My therapist says it's trauma, that I can't internalize my success because my early experiences taught me that good things don't last." She paused. "Seeing you last night, watching you handle that situation with such calm dignity, it reminded me that real strength isn't about money or power. It's about knowing who you are and refusing to be diminished by other people's cruelty. You taught me that when I was 17, and you taught me again last night." I felt tears prick my eyes. "Julia, you've taught yourself most of what you know. I was just lucky enough to be there at the right moment." We talked for another 20 minutes, catching up on decades, sharing stories about students and foster care and building businesses and growing old. Before we hung up, Julia said, "Mrs. Chen, I want to add a provision to my will. If anything happens to me, I want you to take over selecting the scholarship recipients. I can't think of anyone better qualified to continue that work." The responsibility she was offering felt enormous. "Julia, I'm 71 years old. Statistically speaking, I'll probably die before you do." Julia laughed. "Fair point. Okay, contingency plan. You help me train someone else to select recipients using your standards and approach. Deal?" I smiled. "Deal." After we hung up, I sat in my quiet living room thinking about legacy. What did we leave behind when we died? Not money or property. Those things got divided among heirs and eventually spent or sold. What persisted was impact. The ways we'd changed other people's lives, the ripples that extended far beyond our direct reach. Julia's scholarship fund would continue helping future teachers long after both of us were gone. Monday morning, I called the therapist whose number I'd gotten from my insurance provider. The receptionist scheduled me for an intake appointment the following week. "Just for yourself, or will anyone be joining you?" she asked. I explained the situation. Daughter-in-law with family conflict, plan for joint sessions eventually. The receptionist didn't sound surprised. "We see that dynamic fairly often," she said. "Family systems are complicated. Dr. Morrison specializes in intergenerational issues. You'll like her." I hoped she was right. The thought of therapy at 71 felt strange. Shouldn't I have figured myself out by now? But maybe that was the point. Maybe growth didn't stop at any particular age. Maybe you kept learning and changing until the day you died. The appointment was set for Thursday afternoon. I marked it in my calendar, the old-fashioned paper, one I kept by the phone. I'd never gotten used to digital calendars, preferred the tactile satisfaction of writing by hand. David called Tuesday evening. "Mom, I wanted you to know that Victoria and I both made therapy appointments. She's seeing someone Thursday, I'm seeing someone Friday, and we found a couples counselor who can see us together starting next month." His voice carried a note of determination I hadn't heard in years. "I'm also setting better boundaries with Victoria about how she speaks about you. And I told her that from now on, we're including you in our major life events and decisions, not as an afterthought, but as a priority." I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten it was there. "Thank you, David. That means a lot." We talked for a few more minutes about logistics, about Sunday dinner, about nothing and everything. When we hung up, I felt cautiously hopeful. Change was possible, even in relationships that had calcified into unhealthy patterns. It required work and discomfort and willingness to examine your own failures, but it was possible. Thursday afternoon, I drove to Dr. Morrison's office, a small suite in a professional building near the hospital. The waiting room was painted a soothing sage green, with comfortable chairs and magazines I had no interest in reading. Dr. Morrison turned out to be a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and an unhurried manner. She invited me into her office and we spent 90 minutes talking about my life, my childhood, my marriage, my husband's death, raising 2 sons alone, my teaching career, my current relationship with David and Victoria. I cried twice during the session, once when talking about Thomas, and once when describing Victoria's comments at the gala. Dr. Morrison listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that made me think deeper about my own patterns and choices. "You've spent your entire adult life taking care of other people," she observed near the end of our session. "Your sons, your students, even now trying to repair your relationship with your daughter-in-law. When do you take care of yourself, Margaret?" The question hung in the air between us. When did I take care of myself? I gardened, I read books, I made myself decent meals. But those were maintenance activities, basic self-care. When had I last done something purely for joy, purely because I wanted to? I couldn't remember. Dr. Morrison smiled gently. "I'm not criticizing, just observing. Many women of your generation were taught that self-sacrifice was virtue, that putting yourself first was selfish, but you can't pour from an empty cup. As we work together, I'd like you to start identifying what fills your cup, what brings you joy beyond duty or obligation." She gave me homework. Keep a journal noting moments when I felt genuinely joyful, moments when I felt depleted, and start to notice patterns. I left her office feeling both exhausted and oddly energized. Therapy was hard work, but it was work that felt worthwhile. Maybe at 71 I could still learn new ways of being in the world, new ways of relating to myself and others. Sunday dinner approached with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. I cleaned my house, changed the sheets in the guest room just in case, and prepared a simple meal: roasted chicken, green beans from the garden, mashed potatoes, and apple pie for dessert. David and Victoria arrived at 6 o'clock, carrying flowers and a bottle of wine. Victoria's makeup was more subdued than usual, her dress casual. She looked nervous. "Margaret, thank you for having us," she said formally, handing me the flowers. They were beautiful, a mixed bouquet of roses and lilies and something purple I didn't recognize. I put them in my good vase, the crystal one that had been a wedding gift, and set them on the dining room table. We made small talk while I finished cooking. David told stories about his recent work trip. Victoria mentioned a foster child she'd been helping find an apartment. The conversation felt stilted but sincere, everyone trying hard to do better. We sat down to eat, and I said a simple grace the way my mother had taught me, thanking God for food and family and second chances. Halfway through dinner, Victoria set down her fork and looked at me directly. "Margaret, I started therapy last week. My first session was really hard. Dr. Ellis asked me to describe my relationship with my mother, and I ended up crying for 40 minutes straight." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were damp. "I realized that I've been trying to prove to David's family that I'm worthy of him, that I'm enough, because I never felt worthy or enough for my own mother. And instead of trying to build relationships, I've been pushing everyone away preemptively, so it hurts less when they reject me." She took a shaky breath. That's not an excuse for how I've treated you, but it's an explanation, and I'm working on it. I'm working on being better. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand briefly. Victoria, I appreciate you sharing that with me. Therapy is hard work. I started going this week too, and my therapist asked me similar questions about my own patterns. David looked surprised. Mom, you're in therapy? I nodded. Dr. Morrison, she's helping me examine how I take care of everyone else but forget to take care of myself. How I avoid conflict to keep the peace, even when avoiding conflict means accepting mistreatment. I looked at both of them. We all have work to do. This family has developed unhealthy patterns, and changing those patterns requires effort from everyone involved. The rest of dinner passed with surprising ease. We talked about Victoria's volunteer work, about David's hopes for promotion, about my upcoming role on Julia's scholarship committee. We talked about small things, movies we'd seen, books we'd read, recipes we wanted to try. Simple conversation, the kind families are supposed to have when they actually like each other. After dinner, we did dishes together, a team effort that felt comfortable and right. When they left around 9 o'clock, Victoria hugged me carefully, as if afraid I might break or reject her. I hugged her back, not quite ready to call us close, but willing to work toward closeness. Over the following weeks, a new routine established itself. Sunday dinners became regular events, alternating between my house and David's. Victoria and I started having coffee together on Wednesday mornings, just the two of us, talking carefully through our respective therapy insights and trying to understand each other better. We weren't friends yet, might never be friends, but we were building something that resembled mutual respect. I attended my therapy sessions diligently, doing the homework Dr. Morrison assigned, learning to recognize when I was prioritizing others' needs at the expense of my own. I started making small changes, signing up for a watercolor class at the community center, something I'd always wanted to try but never prioritized. Planning a weekend trip to Charleston for my 72nd birthday next spring. Saying no when David asked me to babysit on a day I had other plans, without guilt or extensive justification. Just no, that doesn't work for me. Learning that no was a complete sentence. Julia and I met for coffee regularly, usually at a small cafe near her office. She'd tell me about her business deals and her struggles with therapy and her fear that success was temporary. I'd tell her about my students, remembering stories I'd forgotten for years. One morning in late October, she brought me a framed photograph, the two of us from the Gala night, taken by someone's phone and printed. We stood side by side, Julia's arm around my shoulders, both of us smiling. I looked at my face in the photo and barely recognized myself. The woman in that picture looked happy and confident, secure in her own worth. When had I started looking like that? Julia had written on the frame's matting, Mrs. Chen and her best investment, September 2025. I hung it in my living room where I could see it every day. A reminder that impact mattered, that lives touched, rippled outward in ways you couldn't predict, that teaching had never been just a job but a calling I'd answered faithfully for 38 years. November brought the first scholarship committee meeting. I drove to the Grandview, now familiar with the route, and found the private dining room on the second floor. Julia was already there, along with 3 other committee members, a retired principal, a current college student on scholarship, and a local businesswoman who funded educational programs. We spent 3 hours reviewing applications, reading essays about why young people wanted to become teachers. Some essays were technically perfect, but emotionally cold. Others were grammatically messy, but burned with genuine passion. I found myself gravitating toward the messy, passionate ones, remembering my own writing at that age, remembering students like Julia who had fire, but needed someone to believe in them. We debated, discussed, compared notes. By the end of the meeting, we'd narrowed 50 applications to 15 finalists. The next meeting would involve interviews. I drove home feeling purposeful and needed, feeling like my experience mattered, like I had something valuable to contribute beyond domestic labor and family maintenance. Winter came early that year, snow falling before Thanksgiving and staying through Christmas. David and Victoria hosted Christmas dinner, a formal affair with too much food, and David's brother flying in from Seattle with his family. Victoria was nervous, wanting everything perfect, but she'd learned to ask for help instead of controlling everything herself. I made my traditional apple pie, the recipe my mother had used, the one that required hand-rolled crust and local apples and patience. The pie came out perfect, golden and fragrant. During dinner, Victoria's mother called, a stilted conversation where Victoria tried to explain her new boundaries around emotional availability. It didn't go well. Victoria hung up looking shaken. I caught her eye across the table and nodded, a gesture of solidarity. She nodded back, gratitude in her expression. We were becoming allies, Victoria and I, united by our commitment to building healthier family patterns. That felt like progress, like something worth celebrating quietly. In January, I attended a joint therapy session with David and Victoria, all three of us crammed into Dr. Morrison's office. We talked for 90 minutes about family dynamics, about Victoria's fear of inadequacy, about David's conflict avoidance, about my tendency to minimize my own needs. It was uncomfortable and raw and necessary. Victoria apologized again for the Gala incident, with Dr. Morrison guiding her through a proper apology that took responsibility without making excuses. I accepted the apology and offered my own, for not speaking up sooner about how Victoria's behavior affected me, for enabling unhealthy patterns by staying silent. We talked about how to move forward, establishing clear expectations and boundaries. By the end of the session, we were all exhausted but lighter, as if we'd collectively put down heavy bags we'd been carrying too long. Dr. Morrison smiled. "This is good work, all of you. Keep going." We kept going. The scholarship finalists came in for interviews in February. We met with each candidate for 30 minutes, asking about their motivations for teaching, their understanding of the challenges, their hopes for their future students. A young woman named Maria broke down crying when we asked about her inspiration for becoming a teacher. "I had one teacher who saw me," she said through tears. "Just one, in 8 years of school. She noticed that I was smart, even though I was quiet, that I had ideas, even though I was scared to share them. She made me feel like I mattered. I want to be that for other kids." I looked at Julia, who was also tearing up. We both knew what that felt like, being the kid who needed someone to see them. Maria became one of our 5 scholarship recipients. At the award ceremony in March, I watched her accept her scholarship check and felt that familiar teacher pride, the knowledge that you'd helped launch someone toward their future. Julia squeezed my hand. "We did good, Mrs. Chen," she whispered. I squeezed back. We did. Spring arrived slowly, winter releasing its grip reluctantly. My garden came back to life, bulbs pushing through thawed earth, branches budding green. I spent April mornings outside, preparing soil, planting seeds, talking to my plants the way I'd always done. The watercolor class had taught me that I had no natural talent for painting, but I enjoyed it anyway. The process of mixing colors and making marks on paper. Not everything had to be about achievement or excellence. Some things could just be about joy, about trying, about the pleasure of learning something new at 72 years old. My trip to Charleston was scheduled for late May, a solo adventure to celebrate my birthday. I'd booked a small bed and breakfast, planned tours of historical sites and gardens. I was nervous about traveling alone, but also excited, reclaiming a piece of independence I'd surrendered when Thomas died, and I became solely responsible for keeping my family afloat. Victoria threw me a surprise birthday party at David's house, inviting people from my past, former teaching colleagues, neighbors, even a few former students who'd stayed in touch over the years. Julia came, of course, and Carolyn, and to my shock, Sarah Patterson, the mayor's daughter who'd become a public defender. They'd tracked down my address through various connections and wanted to celebrate me properly. The living room was decorated with photographs from throughout my life. Me as a young teacher, me with my sons, me at various school events over the years. Victoria had put it all together, spending weeks gathering photos and contacting people. When I walked in and everyone yelled, "Surprise!" I actually burst into tears. Victoria hugged me tight. "You deserve to be celebrated, Margaret. You've spent your whole life celebrating other people. It's your turn." The party lasted hours, full of stories and laughter and people reminding me of moments I'd forgotten. Students I'd helped without realizing the depth of impact. The Charleston trip was everything I'd hoped for and more. I walked through historic districts, toured plantation gardens, ate she-crab soup at recommended restaurants, read novels on the bed and breakfast porch. I was alone but not lonely, content in my own company, enjoying the freedom to move at my own pace without accommodating anyone else's preferences or schedule. One afternoon, sitting in a garden courtyard surrounded by azaleas in full bloom, I realized I was happy, not contentedly settled, not merely fine, but genuinely happy. At 72 years old, after years of widowhood and struggle and prioritizing everyone else's needs, I'd found my way back to joy. The realization made me cry, tears running down my face while tourists walked past probably thinking I was having some kind of crisis. But they were good tears, grateful tears, the kind that came from recognizing grace when it appeared. I sat in that garden for 2 hours, just breathing, just being, just appreciating this moment of peace. I returned from Charleston to find that Julia had bought the building next to one of her properties and was converting it into a teaching resource center, offering free supplies and professional development for public school teachers. She'd named it the Margaret Chen Teaching Excellence Center. I wanted to do something bigger than scholarships, she explained when she showed me the architectural plans. I wanted to create a space where teachers feel valued and supported, where they can get materials without spending their own money, where they can learn new strategies without judgment. And I wanted it to carry your name, so everyone knows that good teaching matters, that teachers who believe in their students can change the world. The center would open in September, with a ribbon-cutting ceremony and everything. I was overwhelmed by the gesture, by the idea that my name would be attached to something so substantial and lasting. Julia just smiled. "Mrs. Chen, you changed my life with a few words and some lunch periods. This is the least I can do." Summer passed in a pleasant blur of garden work and therapy sessions and family dinners and watercolor classes and coffee with Julia. Victoria and I had developed something resembling friendship, built on mutual respect and hard-earned understanding. She still had bad days, still struggled with her own insecurities and family wounds, but she was trying, genuinely trying to be better. David had become more assertive in standing up for me, setting boundaries with Victoria when necessary, no longer avoiding conflict at all costs. We were all works in progress, all learning and growing and stumbling forward. Dr. Morrison said that was what healthy families did, not achieving perfection, but committing to continuous improvement. I believed her. The teaching center opened in September with a ceremony that felt overwhelming. Local news covered it, the mayor gave a speech, former students showed up to honor me. I gave brief remarks, thanking Julia and everyone who'd supported teachers over the years. The center itself was beautiful. Bright classrooms, shelves stocked with supplies, comfortable furniture for professional development sessions. Teachers started using it immediately. October brought the second round of scholarship applications and committee meetings. This time, I felt confident in my role, comfortable voicing opinions and advocating for candidates I believed in. We selected 5 new recipients, including a young man who'd been in foster care like Julia, who wrote about wanting to be the stable adult presence he'd never had. Julia cried reading his essay. "That was me," she whispered. "That's exactly how I felt." We awarded him a full scholarship, and Julia personally mentored him throughout his first semester, offering advice and support, and occasionally tough love when he struggled. Watching her pay forward what I'd given her, that felt like the culmination of something important, a circle completing itself. This was what legacy looked like in practice, not monuments or wealth or fame, but people helping people, generation after generation, each person lifting the next. I'd taught Julia. Julia was teaching this young man. Someday, he'd teach his own students. The chain continued, unbreaking and beautiful. Winter came again, my second winter in this new version of my life. I was 73 now, moving a bit slower, joints aching on cold mornings, but happy. Deeply, genuinely happy. Sunday dinners continued. Holidays were shared peacefully. Therapy sessions had become less frequent, but still valuable. Victoria and I texted regularly, sharing small moments, a funny meme, a recipe, a thought about our respective therapy breakthroughs. David called twice a week just to chat. No agenda, just wanting to connect. Julia and I met for coffee monthly, sometimes more often. The teaching center was thriving, serving 200 teachers across the district. Former students continued to reach out, sharing their lives and successes. My garden waited dormant under snow, resting before spring's renewal. I sat in my small house reading by the fireplace, my grandmother's pearl clutch displayed on the mantel as a reminder of the night everything changed, the night I decided I was worth defending, worth celebrating, worth taking up space in rooms that tried to diminish me. Looking back, the moment at the gala felt both monumental and ordinary. Victoria's cruelty had forced a reckoning that needed to happen, but the real work came after, in therapy sessions and difficult conversations and small daily choices to prioritize my own well-being. The owner's table had been symbolic, a moment of justice that felt satisfying in the way dramatic turnarounds always do. But lasting change required grinding effort, required showing up week after week to do hard emotional labor, required believing that people could grow if they chose growth. We'd all chosen growth, Victoria, David, and me. And that choice, more than any single dramatic moment, had transformed our family. I still wasn't perfect, would never be perfect. I still made mistakes, still had days where I reverted to old patterns of self-sacrifice or conflict avoidance. But I was trying, learning, growing. At 73, I was still becoming. That seemed like the best possible outcome, the truest victory. Not a fairy tale ending, but a real life continuing, imperfect and beautiful, and mine.